The gunshot echoed across the dusty plains, startling Kathleen Morgan as she clutched her 3-month-old son closer to her chest. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the desolate trail, and she knew traveling alone had been a mistake. Her horse had gone lame 2 miles back, forcing her to continue on foot toward the distant town of Silver Creek. The baby whimpered, sensing his mother's fear as the sound of hoofbeats grew louder behind them. "Please, not bandits," she whispered, quickening her pace despite her exhaustion. The year was 1873, and the Western Territories were still wild and untamed, no place for a widow with an infant. The rider approached rapidly, and Kathleen had nowhere to hide on the open trail. She turned, ready to face whatever threat came her way, her free hand gripping the small Derringer pistol concealed in her skirt pocket, the last gift from her late husband. The man who reined his horse to a stop before her wasn't what she expected. Tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a summer storm, he studied her with a mix of concern and curiosity. No bandana masked his face, and the badge pinned to his vest caught the dying sunlight. "Madam," he tipped his hat, "dangerous place to be walking alone, especially with a little one." His voice was deep but gentle. "Zachary Blackwood, Deputy Sheriff of Silver Creek." Kathleen exhaled slowly, relief washing over her. "Kathleen Morgan, my horse went lame a couple miles back. I'm trying to reach Silver Creek before nightfall." The baby began to cry, his tiny face reddening with effort. Zachary dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots raising small clouds of dust as they hit the ground. "That's still 4 miles ahead, Mrs. Morgan, not a journey to make on foot." His eyes settled on the infant. "May I help you?" There was something in his expression as he looked at her son, something that spoke of longing and loss. Before she could respond, the distant howl of wolves carried on the wind. "You can ride with me," he offered, reaching for the reins of his horse. "Night's coming and it's not safe out here." Kathleen hesitated, years of caution making her wary, yet something about the deputy's honest face and the imminent darkness convinced her. "Thank you, Deputy Blackwood." As he helped her onto his horse, the baby settled, staring up at the stranger with curious eyes. Zachary smiled at the infant, a smile that transformed his rugged features. "Handsome boy you have there, Mrs. Morgan," he said, mounting behind her. "What's his name?" "James," she replied, feeling the strange intimacy of sharing the saddle with this unknown man. "After his father." She felt rather than saw Zachary nod. His arms reached around her to take the reins, creating a secure circle that oddly didn't feel intrusive. "I'm sorry for your loss, madam," he said quietly. Kathleen stiffened. "How did you know?" "The way you said his name," Zachary replied simply. "And a husband wouldn't let his wife and child travel these roads alone." They rode in silence for a while, the rhythmic movement of the horse lulling little James to sleep. The vast landscape spread around them, painted in deepening shades of purple and gold as the sun continued its descent. "What brings you to Silver Creek?" Zachary finally asked, his breath warm against her ear. "A fresh start," she answered, choosing her words carefully. "James was born in Denver. His father never got to meet him." Zachary's arms tightened imperceptibly around her. "War, consumption," she corrected. "He passed 2 months before James was born." The deputy was quiet for a moment. "Silver Creek's a good place for fresh starts, small but decent folk mostly." "Do you know of any work for a woman with a child?" Kathleen asked, voicing the concern that had been weighing on her mind. Her small savings wouldn't last long. As it happens, the town's schoolteacher just left to get married. Mayor's been looking for a replacement. Hope flickered in Kathleen's chest. "I was a teacher in Denver before I married." She felt Zachary smile. "Then perhaps fate has a hand in our meeting, Mrs. Morgan." As they crested a hill, the lights of Silver Creek came into view, a small constellation of warmth in the gathering darkness. Kathleen felt a strange sense of coming home, though she'd never set foot in the town before. "I'll take you to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house," Zachary said. Best place in town for a lady and child. As they rode down the main street, Kathleen noticed how people nodded respectfully to the deputy. He was clearly well regarded here. The boarding house was a tidy two-story building with lace curtains and a small garden out front. Zachary helped her down from the horse, then carefully handed James back to her. The baby stirred but didn't wake. "Thank you, deputy," Kathleen said, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "I'm not sure what I would have done if you hadn't come along." Something passed across his face, an emotion she couldn't quite name. He looked at James again, with that same expression of longing she'd noticed earlier. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, his voice low, "I hope you find what you're looking for in Silver Creek." Before she could respond, the door of the boarding house opened and a plump, gray-haired woman appeared. "Zachary Blackwood, is that you bringing visitors at this hour?" the woman called. "Mrs. Holloway," he replied with a smile, "I've found someone who might solve the mayor's problem. Mrs. Morgan here is a teacher from Denver." Mrs. Holloway's face brightened as she bustled down the steps. "Well now, isn't that Providence? Come in, dear, you must be exhausted." Kathleen turned to thank the deputy again, but he was already mounting his horse. "I'll speak to the mayor first thing tomorrow," he said, tipping his hat. "Rest well, Mrs. Morgan." As he rode away, Kathleen couldn't help but wonder about the look in his eyes when he'd gazed at her son. There was a story there, one she found herself wanting to learn. Mrs. Holloway ushered her inside, chattering about clean sheets and warm milk, but Kathleen's thoughts remained with the deputy. In a single afternoon, her fortunes had changed, and she couldn't shake the feeling that meeting Zachary Blackwood was just the beginning of something important. The boarding house was cozy and clean, smelling of beeswax and fresh bread. Mrs. Holloway showed Kathleen to a small but comfortable room on the second floor with a view of the main street and the distant mountains. "There's a cradle in the corner, dear," the older woman said, lighting the bedside lamp. "Had it since my own children were small. Too precious to part with even when they grew." Kathleen laid James in the cradle, grateful for the older woman's thoughtfulness. "You're very kind, Mrs. Holloway. Call me Martha, dear, everyone does." She bustled about, pulling back the bed covers. "Now you must be starving." "I'll bring up some stew and bread." "Thank you, but I don't want to be any trouble." Martha waved away her protest. "Nonsense. Can't have you going to bed hungry. Besides, I want to hear how a young widow with a baby ended up on the trail to Silver Creek with our deputy." After Martha left, Kathleen sat on the edge of the bed, the events of the day catching up with her. 6 months ago, she'd been a happily married woman, eagerly awaiting the birth of her first child. Now she was a widow, alone in a strange town, with only her skills and determination to see her through. When Martha returned with a tray of food, Kathleen found herself sharing her story about her husband James Sr., a bank clerk who'd fallen ill suddenly, about the difficult birth of little James during a Denver blizzard, about the dwindling funds that had finally forced her to seek work elsewhere. "Denver's expensive," she explained, breaking off a piece of bread. "And with so many educated men returning from the war, teaching positions are scarce. I saw an advertisement in the newspaper about Western towns needing teachers." Martha nodded sympathetically. "Many of our young men never came back from that terrible war, left a lot of gaps in towns like ours." She glanced at the sleeping baby. "Your boy will be welcome here. Children are precious in Silver Creek." Deputy Blackwood mentioned the schoolteacher position. "Yes, Miss Peterson left us last month to marry a rancher from Wyoming," Martha confirmed. "The children have been running wild ever since. Mayor Thompson will be delighted to meet you." Kathleen took a sip of tea. "The deputy seems well respected here." Something knowing glinted in Martha's eyes. "Zachary's a good man, been our deputy for 5 years now. Sheriff Bradley depends on him completely." She hesitated, then added, "He's had his share of sorrow too." Kathleen's curiosity was piqued, but she didn't want to pry. "He was very kind to help us." "That's his way," Martha said, rising from her chair. "Get some rest now, dear. Tomorrow's likely to be busy." After Martha left, Kathleen finished her meal and prepared for bed, her mind full of questions about her new home and the deputy with the storm-gray eyes who had looked at her son with such longing. Morning brought bright sunshine and the sounds of a town coming to life. James woke early, hungry and fussy. After feeding and changing him, Kathleen dressed in her best remaining dress, a simple blue cotton with white trim. Her wardrobe had diminished considerably during the difficult months after her husband's death. A knock at the door revealed Martha bearing a breakfast tray. "Good morning, dear. Sleep well." "Better than I have in months," Kathleen admitted, settling James on her lap as she accepted a cup of coffee. "Deputy Blackwood stopped by at first light," Martha informed her, a slight smile playing on her lips. "Mayor Thompson will see you at 9 o'clock at the town hall. The deputy offered to escort you there." Kathleen felt an unexpected flutter in her stomach. "That's very considerate of him." "Zachary said he'd return at 8:30. Martha glanced at the small clock on the mantel. "Just enough time to finish breakfast and get that little one ready." At precisely 8:30, Kathleen heard the deputy's voice downstairs. Martha had offered to watch James during the meeting, so Kathleen handed over her son with detailed instructions and a mother's natural anxiety. "He'll be fine," Martha assured her, cradling the infant with practiced ease. "I raised 5 of my own." Zachary stood in the parlor, hat in hand. He looked different in the daylight, still imposing, but somehow more approachable. He'd shaved, and his dark hair was neatly combed. The badge on his chest caught the morning light. "Mrs. Morgan," he greeted her with a slight bow, "I trust you rested well." "Very well, thank you, Deputy," she replied, suddenly conscious of how plain her dress was. "And thank you for arranging this meeting. Mayor Thompson is eager to meet you." He offered his arm. "Shall we?" The morning air was crisp and clean as they walked down the main street. Silver Creek was larger than it had appeared in the twilight, a proper frontier town with a general store, a bank, a church, a saloon, and various other businesses lining the wide dirt street. "The schoolhouse is at the end of town," Zachary explained, nodding toward a white building with a small bell tower. 28 pupils at last count, ages 6 to 16. Kathleen took in the information eagerly. A good size for one teacher. "The previous teacher complained it was too many," he said, watching her reaction. She lifted her chin slightly. "In Denver, I had 45 students in one room." Zachary's lips curved into a smile. "I thought you might say something like that." The town hall was a substantial building in the center of town. Inside, Mayor Thompson proved to be a portly, genial man with an impressive mustache and a businesslike manner. "Mrs. Morgan," he said after introductions were made, "our deputy speaks highly of your qualifications." "You taught in Denver, I understand." "For 3 years before my marriage, yes," she confirmed, sitting primly on the edge of the offered chair. "And I helped establish a night school for working men who wish to improve their literacy." The mayor looked impressed. "That shows initiative. We need that quality here in Silver Creek." He stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "The position pays $30 a month with quarters in the rooms above the schoolhouse. Term begins in 2 weeks. It was less than she'd earned in Denver, but with lodging included, it would be enough." "That sounds fair, Mayor Thompson." "There is one concern," the mayor said, glancing at Zachary. "Your child. The previous teacher was unmarried without dependents." Kathleen felt her heart sink. "My son is very young. He wouldn't disrupt classes." "What the mayor means," Zachary interjected, "is that teaching and caring for an infant alone might prove challenging." "I'm not one to shy away from challenges, Deputy," she replied, perhaps more sharply than intended. The mayor cleared his throat. "Several of the older girls could assist during school hours, I suppose, and Mrs. Holloway has been known to help with little ones." "I can manage," Kathleen insisted, seeing her opportunity beginning to slip away. Zachary stepped forward. "Mayor, if I may suggest, my sister Caroline recently lost her position as a nanny in Denver. She's considering joining me here. She would be the perfect help for Mrs. Morgan during school hours." Kathleen looked at him in surprise. This was the first mention of a sister. "Excellent idea, Zachary," the mayor said, brightening. "When could she arrive? I'll wire her today. She could be here within the week." The mayor turned back to Kathleen. "Then it's settled, Mrs. Morgan. The position is yours, contingent on the arrival of suitable help with your child." Relief flooded through her. "Thank you, Mayor Thompson. I won't disappoint you." After finalizing details and signing the necessary papers, Kathleen found herself back on the street with Zachary, now officially the new schoolteacher of Silver Creek. "I don't know how to thank you," she said as they walked back toward the boarding house. "But I have to ask, do you really have a sister named Caroline?" Zachary's expression was unreadable. "I do. Whether she'll come is another matter. We haven't spoken in some time." "Oh." Kathleen felt a pang of guilt. "I wouldn't want to cause a family rift." "The rift existed long before you arrived, Mrs. Morgan," he said quietly. "Perhaps this is an opportunity to mend it." They walked in silence for a moment before Kathleen gathered the courage to ask, "Why did you help me?" "You don't know anything about me." Zachary stopped walking and turned to face her. The morning sun highlighted the fine lines around his eyes, evidence of a man who spent his days outdoors. "I know enough," he said simply. "I know you're brave enough to travel alone with your child to build a new life. I know you're qualified for a job our town desperately needs filled. And I know that sometimes people deserve a helping hand." There was something in his voice that suggested personal experience with hardship. Kathleen found herself wanting to know more about this man who had so quickly become her benefactor. "Still," she persisted, "offering your sister's services is beyond kindness." A shadow crossed his face. "Caroline needs a fresh start as much as you do." He glanced at the position of the sun. "I should get back to my duties. The sheriff will be wondering where I've disappeared to." As they reached the boarding house, Zachary tipped his hat. "I'll let you know when I hear from my sister." "Deputy," Kathleen called as he turned to leave, "would you like to meet James properly?" "You only saw him when he was sleeping." Something flickered in his eyes, that same look of longing she'd noticed the day before. "I'd like that very much, Mrs. Morgan." Inside, they found Martha in the kitchen, bouncing James on her knee while she sang a nursery rhyme. The baby was gurgling happily, tiny fists waving in the air. "There's his mama," Martha cooed, looking up as they entered. "And the deputy too. My, aren't we honored?" Kathleen took James from Martha's arms and turned to Zachary. "Deputy Blackwood, this is James Morgan Jr., my son." Zachary removed his hat, a gesture of respect that touched Kathleen deeply. "Hello, James," he said softly. The baby studied the stranger with solemn eyes before breaking into a toothless grin. Without thinking, Kathleen asked, "Would you like to hold him?" Zachary looked startled, then almost shy. "It's been a long time since I held a baby." "It's not something you forget," she assured him, carefully transferring James to the deputy's strong arms. Zachary adjusted his hold with surprising gentleness, cradling the infant securely. James reached up, fascinated by the shiny badge on the deputy's chest. "He likes you," Kathleen observed. "Smart boy," Martha commented from the stove, where she was stirring a pot of something fragrant. "Knows quality when he sees it." Zachary didn't seem to hear either of them. He was looking down at James with an expression of wonder and something deeper, something that made Kathleen's heart ache with curiosity. "He has your eyes," Zachary said finally, looking up at Kathleen. "Yes," she agreed, "but his father's chin and nose." Zachary nodded, studying the baby's features as if committing them to memory. Then, reluctantly, he handed James back to his mother. "Thank you," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "I should go. Sheriff's expecting me." As he replaced his hat and headed for the door, Kathleen called after him, "Deputy, the teaching position, thank you for believing in me." He paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Everyone deserves a second chance at happiness, Mrs. Morgan, even widows and estranged siblings." After he left, Martha gave Kathleen a knowing look. "That man has a story, mark my words." "Yes," Kathleen agreed, bouncing James gently in her arms, "and somehow I think it might be intertwined with ours now." The following days passed in a flurry of activity. Kathleen was given a tour of the schoolhouse by Mayor Thompson's wife, a bird-like woman with keen intelligence behind her spectacles. The classroom was spacious and well lit, with rows of desks facing a large blackboard. The living quarters upstairs consisted of 2 rooms, a bedroom, and a combined kitchen and sitting area. "It's not fancy," Mrs. Thompson apologized, but the previous teachers found it comfortable enough. "It's perfect," Kathleen assured her, already planning where to place James's cradle. The town welcomed her warmly. Parents stopped by to introduce themselves and their children. The general store owner, Mr. Finley, offered credit until her first paycheck. The minister's wife organized a small gathering of women who arrived bearing household items and baby clothes. Through it all, Kathleen caught only glimpses of Deputy Blackwood. He tipped his hat when they passed on the street, inquired politely about James, but maintained a certain distance that puzzled her after his initial kindness. On her 4th day in Silver Creek, Kathleen was arranging books in the schoolroom when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Zachary appeared in the doorway, his expression uncharacteristically tense. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, removing his hat. "I received a telegram from my sister." Kathleen set down the book she was holding. "Will she come?" "Yes." He seemed surprised by the answer himself. "She arrives on tomorrow's stage." "That's wonderful news," Kathleen said, genuinely pleased. "I look forward to meeting her." Zachary rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as a sign of discomfort. "There's something you should know before she arrives. Caroline, she's experienced loss. Her husband and infant son died in a fire 3 years ago." Understanding dawned on Kathleen. "That's why you looked at James that way." "What way?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral with longing, with sadness. She took a step toward him. "You were thinking of your sister's child." Zachary's jaw tightened. "Among other things. Will it be difficult for her being around James?" "I don't know," he admitted. "We haven't spoken much since the tragedy. She blamed me in part." Kathleen's brow furrowed. "Why would she blame you?" He met her eyes directly. "I was the sheriff in the town where they lived. I was responsible for public safety. The fire that killed Thomas and little Michael started in the jail after a prisoner set his mattress alight. It spread to half the town before we could contain it." "That's terrible," Kathleen whispered, "but surely not your fault." "I should have been there. I was out tracking a horse thief." His eyes clouded with old pain. "By the time I returned, it was too late, and your sister has never forgiven you. She left town the day after the funerals, went to Denver, took a position as a nanny." He shook his head slightly. "When I wrote to her about you and James, I didn't expect a response, let alone agreement to come." Kathleen considered this information carefully. "Perhaps she's ready for healing too." "Perhaps." He didn't sound convinced. "I wanted to warn you, Caroline may be difficult at first." "I understand grief, Deputy," Kathleen said softly. "My husband was only 26 when consumption took him. Some days the pain still takes my breath away." Something shifted in Zachary's expression, a recognition of shared experience. "You've managed well for James's sake." "What choice did I have?" She smiled sadly. "Life continues even when we think it shouldn't." He nodded, then glanced around the schoolroom. "You've made progress here. The place hasn't looked this organized in years." "I like order," she explained, grateful for the change of subject. "It helps the students focus." "I'll escort Caroline here when she arrives," Zachary said, moving toward the door. "The stage should reach town around noon." "Deputy," Kathleen called as he reached the threshold. "Thank you for telling me about your sister's past. It helps me understand." He paused, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the bright rectangle of the doorway. "Understanding doesn't always make things easier, Mrs. Morgan." "No," she agreed, "but it makes them possible." After he left, Kathleen returned to her books, but her mind remained on the deputy and his estranged sister. The tragedy that had separated them was heartbreaking, yet Kathleen couldn't help feeling that perhaps fate had brought them all together for a reason. The next day dawned clear and warm. Kathleen dressed with particular care, wanting to make a good impression on Caroline Blackwood. James was unusually cooperative, taking his morning feeding without fuss and falling asleep promptly afterward. Martha had insisted on accompanying them to meet the stage. "First impressions matter," she declared, pinning her best hat firmly in place. "And 4 eyes are better than 2 when sizing up a person's character." They waited on the boardwalk outside the general store, James sleeping peacefully in Kathleen's arms. The stage was running late, as it often did according to Martha. "There's Zachary." Martha nodded toward the sheriff's office across the street. The deputy emerged, checking his pocket watch before crossing to join them. He'd changed from his usual work clothes into a clean shirt and vest, his badge polished to a shine. "Ladies," he greeted them, his eyes lingering briefly on James. "Stage should be here any minute. Ryder came ahead to say they're just outside town." As if on cue, they heard the distant rumble of wheels and the crack of a whip. The stagecoach appeared at the end of the street, raising dust as it rattled toward the depot. "Always makes an entrance, that driver," Martha commented. "Showman at heart." The coach pulled to a stop with a final dramatic flourish from the driver. Passengers began to disembark: a traveling salesman, a middle-aged couple, and finally, a slender woman in a navy blue traveling suit. Even from a distance, the family resemblance was clear. Kathleen Blackwood had the same storm-gray eyes as her brother, though her features were finer. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe style that emphasized her high cheekbones and the tightness around her mouth. Zachary stepped forward to greet his sister. There was a moment of awkward hesitation before Caroline allowed him to kiss her cheek. Their exchange was too quiet for Kathleen to hear, but the stiffness in Caroline's posture spoke volumes. Zachary turned and beckoned to Kathleen and Martha. "Caroline, I'd like you to meet Mrs. Kathleen Morgan, our new schoolteacher, and Mrs. Martha Holloway, who runs the boarding house." Caroline's gaze immediately went to the bundle in Kathleen's arms. Something flickered across her face: pain, longing, resentment, before she composed herself. "Mrs. Morgan," she said, her voice cool but not unfriendly. "My brother has told me about your situation. I'm glad I can be of assistance." "Miss Blackwood," Kathleen replied warmly, "your willingness to come all this way is more than generous. I hope you'll be happy here in Silver Creek." "It's a temporary arrangement," Caroline clarified, glancing at her brother. "Until you find a more permanent solution." Martha, never one to let awkwardness linger, took charge of the situation. "Let's get you settled, Miss Blackwood. You'll stay at my boarding house tonight, and tomorrow we can help you move your things to the schoolhouse." As Martha ushered Caroline toward the waiting luggage, Zachary moved closer to Kathleen. "She's agreed to stay for 3 months, he explained in a low voice. "A trial period." "That's understandable," Kathleen replied, shifting James slightly as he began to stir. "It must be difficult for her, coming back to a place with so many memories." "Silver Creek isn't where it happened," Zachary corrected, "but I suppose any small western town might trigger remembrances." James chose that moment to wake fully, his tiny face scrunching up before he let out a wail. Instinctively, Kathleen began to sway, murmuring soothing words to her son. Caroline, who had been examining her trunk with Martha, turned sharply at the sound. For a moment, naked grief transformed her features. Then, squaring her shoulders, she walked deliberately toward Kathleen. "May I?" she asked, holding out her arms. Kathleen hesitated only briefly before carefully transferring James to Caroline's waiting hands. The woman held him with practiced ease, her body remembering what her heart might wish to forget. "Hello, little one," Caroline said softly, all coolness gone from her voice. "Aren't you handsome?" James, startled by the new face, stared up at Caroline with wide eyes. Then, to everyone's surprise, he smiled a gummy, drooling smile that transformed his tiny face. Caroline's composure cracked. A single tear slid down her cheek before she could master herself. "He's beautiful," she whispered, handing him back to Kathleen as if the contact had suddenly become too much to bear. Zachary watched the exchange with an unreadable expression. "I need to report to the sheriff," he said abruptly. Caroline, I'll check on you this evening. As he strode away, Martha clucked her tongue. Men, always leaving when emotions get involved. Caroline's spine stiffened. My brother has never been comfortable with feelings, especially guilt. We all carry guilt, Kathleen said quietly. It's part of living. Caroline looked at her appraisingly, as if seeing her properly for the first time. Yes, Mrs. Morgan, I suppose it is. The first week with Caroline was a study in contrasts. With James, she was gentle and patient, handling him with obvious expertise and genuine affection. With Zachary, she was distant and formal, speaking to him only when necessary. With Kathleen, she was polite but reserved, maintaining a professional distance. They settled into a routine in the schoolhouse quarters. Caroline took charge of James during school hours, bringing him to Kathleen at lunchtime for feeding. In the evenings, they prepared simple meals together, working around each other in the small kitchen with increasing comfort. On Sunday, the whole town gathered for church services. Kathleen sat with Caroline, who had dressed James in a new gown she'd sewn for him. Zachary sat across the aisle with Sheriff Bradley, a grizzled veteran of the frontier with a booming laugh and a fondness for peppermint candy. After the service, as the congregation mingled on the church steps, Sheriff Bradley approached Kathleen. Mrs. Morgan, he said, tipping his hat. Hope our town is treating you well. Very well, Sheriff, she assured him. Everyone has been most welcoming. Glad to hear it. Zachary tells me you're settling in nicely at the schoolhouse. His eyes twinkled. Says you've even got his sister smiling again, which is something of a miracle. Caroline, who had been speaking with the minister's wife nearby, glanced over at the mention of her name. Her expression cooled noticeably when she saw her brother approaching behind the sheriff. Caroline, Zachary acknowledged her with a nod. You look well. Thank you, she replied stiffly. An uncomfortable silence fell. Kathleen, seeking to ease the tension, said, Miss Blackwood has been a tremendous help with James. I don't know how I would manage without her. Children have a way of healing wounds, Sheriff Bradley observed, looking pointedly at the Blackwood siblings. Speaking of which, there's a town picnic next Saturday. Good opportunity for folks to meet our new schoolteacher properly. A picnic sounds lovely, Kathleen said, bouncing James gently as he began to fuss. Here, let me, Caroline offered, taking the baby from Kathleen's arms. James immediately settled, his small head nestling against Caroline's shoulder. Zachary watched the interaction with that same longing expression Kathleen had noticed before. This time, however, it wasn't focused solely on James but on his sister as well. You always did have a way with little ones, Carrie, he said softly, using what was obviously a childhood nickname. Caroline's head snapped up, her eyes flashing. Don't call me that, not anymore. Zachary's face closed off. My apologies, Miss Blackwood, he said formally, then turned to Kathleen. Mrs. Morgan, if you'll excuse me, I have duties to attend to. As he walked away, Sheriff Bradley sighed heavily. Those two will be the death of me, stubborn as mules, both of them. Caroline handed James back to Kathleen. I'll wait for you at the schoolhouse, Mrs. Morgan, she said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. After she left, Sheriff Bradley shook his head. Sorry about that, Mrs. Morgan. Family feuds are the worst kind. It's not my place to interfere, Kathleen replied, though her heart ached for both siblings. Maybe not, the sheriff said thoughtfully, but sometimes an outsider can see things more clearly than those caught in the middle. He tipped his hat again. Good day to you, madam. Throughout the week that followed, Kathleen observed the Blackwood siblings carefully. Caroline threw herself into caring for James with almost desperate energy, as if the baby represented a second chance at something precious she had lost. Zachary made a point of stopping by the schoolhouse daily, ostensibly to check on their safety, but Kathleen suspected his visits had more to do with catching glimpses of his sister and James. On Wednesday afternoon, as Kathleen was dismissing her students, Zachary appeared at the schoolhouse door. The children greeted him enthusiastically. Clearly, the deputy was popular among the younger set. Deputy Blackwood, Kathleen acknowledged him after the last child had departed. "This is a pleasant surprise, Mrs. Morgan," he replied, removing his hat. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all. I was just finishing for the day." He glanced around the empty classroom. "Is my sister upstairs with James?" "Yes, he was a bit fussy earlier, teething, I think." Zachary nodded, then seemed to gather his resolve. "Actually, I came to speak with you, not Caroline." "Oh." Kathleen began gathering papers from her desk, curious about his serious tone. "It's about the picnic on Saturday." He cleared his throat. "Sheriff Bradley suggested that I escort you and James for propriety's sake." Kathleen looked up, surprised. "That's very thoughtful, but what about your sister?" "Caroline can accompany us, of course," he said quickly. "It would be a family group." The word family hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. Kathleen felt her cheeks warm slightly. "That would be lovely, Deputy," she said carefully. "If you're certain it wouldn't be an imposition." "Not at all." His expression softened. "And please, when we're not in an official capacity, I'd prefer if you called me Zachary." The informality startled her. "Then you must call me Kathleen." A smile transformed his features, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Kathleen," he repeated as if testing the sound of it, "it suits you." The moment was interrupted by Caroline's appearance at the top of the stairs, James cradled in her arms. "Zachary," she said, her tone neutral. "What brings you here?" "Just checking in," he replied, his smile fading. "And making arrangements for the picnic on Saturday. I'll be escorting Mrs. Morgan, Kathleen, and James." Caroline's expression didn't change, but Kathleen sensed a subtle shift in her posture. "I see." "You're included in the invitation, of course," Kathleen added quickly. "Thank you, but I'm not one for large gatherings," Caroline replied. "I'm sure you'll have a lovely time without me." "Caroline," Zachary began, a note of frustration in his voice. "James is ready for his feeding," Caroline interrupted, coming down the stairs to hand the baby to Kathleen. "If you'll excuse me, I need to prepare dinner." She disappeared back upstairs before either of them could respond. Zachary sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I apologize for my sister's behavior." "There's no need," Kathleen assured him, settling James against her shoulder. "Grief affects people differently. Some seek company, others withdraw." "And which were you?" he asked quietly. Kathleen considered the question seriously. "Both at different times. When James was born, I wanted nothing more than to share him with others, to see my husband in his smile, to hear everyone remark on the resemblance. But at night, when it was just the two of us, I wanted the world to disappear." Zachary's gaze was intent, as if he were memorizing her words. "You found balance." "I've tried," she acknowledged. "For James's sake, if not my own." "You're stronger than you realize," he said, his voice low and earnest. Caroline was like that, once determined, resilient. "I hope someday she finds her way back to herself." "Perhaps she already has," Kathleen suggested. "With James, she seems at peace." "I've noticed." He hesitated, then added, "I've also noticed how she looks at you with respect. That's no small thing from my sister." Kathleen felt oddly pleased by this assessment. "I respect her as well. It takes courage to face what frightens you most." Zachary glanced toward the stairs where Caroline had disappeared. "Yes, it does." He replaced his hat, preparing to leave. "I'll call for you around 11 on Saturday." "We'll be ready," Kathleen promised, suddenly looking forward to the picnic with an anticipation that surprised her. After Zachary left, Kathleen climbed the stairs to the living quarters. Caroline was in the kitchen, aggressively kneading dough for biscuits. "You don't have to avoid the picnic on my account," Kathleen said, settling into a chair to feed James. Caroline's hands stilled. "I'm not avoiding anything." "Aren't you?" Kathleen challenged gently. "Your brother is trying, Caroline." "Trying what exactly?" Caroline demanded, flour dusting her forearms. "To ease his conscience, to play happy families." "To reconnect with his only sister," Kathleen countered. "To show that he cares." Caroline resumed her kneading, her movements slightly less forceful. "It's not that simple." "It never is," Kathleen agreed. "But holding on to anger only hurts you, not him." You sound like the minister, Caroline muttered, but there was less bite in her tone. I sound like someone who's lost too much to waste time on grudges, Kathleen corrected. Life is short, Caroline. Painfully short, as both of us know too well. Caroline sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. I know you mean well, Kathleen, but some wounds run too deep for simple forgiveness. Then start with something smaller, Kathleen suggested. Come to the picnic, sit with us, eat some fried chicken. You don't have to forgive everything at once. Caroline looked at her for a long moment, then returned to her dough. I'll think about it. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Kathleen decided to count it as progress. Saturday dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for a picnic. Kathleen dressed James in his best outfit, a little sailor suit that Caroline had altered to fit him perfectly. For herself, she chose a light green dress with white trim, one of the few pretty things she'd kept from her life in Denver. At precisely 11 o'clock, there was a knock at the schoolhouse door. Kathleen opened it to find Zachary standing on the threshold, hat in hand, looking so handsome in his Sunday best that her breath caught momentarily. Good morning, he greeted her, his eyes warming as he took in her appearance. You look lovely. Thank you, she replied, feeling suddenly shy. Please come in, we're almost ready. He stepped inside, glancing around the classroom. Where's James? Upstairs with Caroline. She's just changing him one last time. Kathleen hesitated, then added, she's considering joining us at the picnic. Zachary's expression brightened. Really? That's unexpected. Don't make too much of it, Kathleen cautioned. She's still uncertain. Before he could respond, footsteps sounded on the stairs. Caroline appeared, carrying James, who was gurgling happily in his sailor suit. What surprised Kathleen was that Caroline herself was dressed for an outing, wearing a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. Caroline, Zachary said, his voice carefully neutral. You look well. Thank you, she replied, her tone equally measured. She turned to Kathleen. James is ready. I've packed his extra things in this bag. Kathleen took the offered bag, then asked cautiously, will you be joining us? Caroline glanced at her brother, then back to Kathleen. If the invitation still stands. Of course it does, Zachary said quickly. We'd be delighted to have your company. The walk to the picnic grounds at the edge of town was slightly awkward at first. Zachary carried the picnic basket Martha had prepared for them, while Kathleen pushed James in the small carriage that had been a gift from the town's women. Caroline walked slightly apart, her posture stiff but determined. The picnic grounds were already crowded when they arrived. Blankets dotted the grassy area near the creek, and children ran about playing games. A makeshift table held dishes brought by various families, and somewhere, someone was playing a fiddle. Deputy Blackwood. Mayor Thompson called, waving them over to where he sat with his wife and several other prominent citizens. Mrs. Morgan, come join us. Zachary led them to the mayor's blanket, where introductions were made. Caroline, to Kathleen's surprise, handled the social niceties with grace, though she remained reserved. As the afternoon progressed, Kathleen found herself enjoying the simple pleasures of community life. The food was delicious, the conversation pleasant, and James was passed from admiring arms to admiring arms, soaking up the attention like a little sponge. When it was Caroline's turn to hold him again, Kathleen noticed Zachary watching his sister with an expression of such mingled hope and sorrow that it made her heart ache. He's good with her, Sheriff Bradley commented, settling beside Kathleen on the blanket. Your boy has worked magic on Caroline Blackwood. Children have a way of reaching past our defenses, Kathleen agreed. The sheriff nodded sagely. Been trying to get those two to reconcile for years. Maybe your little one will succeed where I failed. I hope so, Kathleen said sincerely. For both their sakes. And yours? The sheriff asked shrewdly. Kathleen looked at him in surprise. Mine, Mrs. Morgan, I may be old, but I'm not blind, Bradley said with a chuckle. Our deputy hasn't looked at a woman the way he looks at you since he came to Silver Creek. Kathleen felt her cheeks warm. Sheriff Bradley, I hardly think what you like, he interrupted kindly. Just keep your eyes open. Good things sometimes come when we least expect them." With that cryptic advice, he rose and wandered back to the food table. Kathleen watched as Zachary approached his sister, saying something that made Caroline glance down at James, then back at her brother. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded and rose, following Zachary toward the creek with James in her arms. Curious, Kathleen stood and moved to a position where she could observe them without intruding. They stood at the creek's edge, James between them, the sunlight dappling through the trees overhead. They were too far away for Kathleen to hear their words, but their body language spoke volumes. Caroline was speaking, her free hand gesturing occasionally, her gaze mostly on James rather than her brother. Zachary stood with his head slightly bowed, listening intently. Once he reached out as if to touch her arm, then withdrew his hand when she tensed. Then something remarkable happened. Caroline shifted James in her arms, and the baby reached out, grabbing Zachary's finger with his tiny hand. The simple gesture seemed to freeze both siblings. They stared at the connection, the small hand gripping the larger one as if it were a bridge across the chasm between them. Zachary said something, his expression earnest. Caroline looked up, meeting his gaze directly for what seemed like the first time. Her response was too brief for a full acceptance, but when Zachary offered to take James for a moment, she allowed the transfer. The sight of the tall deputy cradling her son with such tenderness brought unexpected tears to Kathleen's eyes. There was something right about the tableau, something that felt like family in a way she hadn't experienced since James S.R.'s death. "They needed this," Martha said softly, appearing at Kathleen's side. "All of them, including you." "I'm just glad they're talking," Kathleen replied, wiping away a stray tear. Martha patted her arm. "Life has a way of working out, dear, sometimes in ways we never imagined." When Zachary and Caroline returned to the picnic blanket, something had shifted between them. The tension hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had eased, making room for something that resembled cautious hope. "James got tired of our serious conversation," Caroline explained, settling back on the blanket. "He wanted to see the ducks." "Did he now?" Kathleen smiled, reclaiming her son from Zachary's arms, already a man with his own mind. "Like his mother," Zachary said, his gaze warm as it rested on Kathleen. The rest of the afternoon passed pleasantly. As the sun began to set, families packed up their belongings and headed back to town. Zachary insisted on escorting Kathleen, James, and Caroline back to the schoolhouse, carrying the now sleeping James in his arms while Kathleen pushed the empty carriage. At the schoolhouse door, Caroline surprised them both by saying, "Thank you for convincing me to come, Kathleen. It was nicer than I expected." "I'm glad," Kathleen replied sincerely. Caroline turned to her brother. "And thank you, Zachary, for what you said at the creek. I'm not ready to forget, but perhaps I can start to forgive." Zachary's expression softened. "That's all I can ask, Caroline." After Caroline had taken James upstairs, Zachary lingered at the door with Kathleen. "What did you say to her?" Kathleen asked curiously. "At the creek," Zachary considered his answer carefully. "I told her about the day I found you on the trail. About how seeing you with James reminded me of what's important in life: family, second chances, moving forward despite the pain. And that helped, perhaps." He smiled slightly. "Or perhaps it was simply James grabbing my finger. Some connections can't be denied, even by the most determined heart." Kathleen felt a flutter in her chest at his words, at the way his gaze held hers. "Thank you for today, Zachary. It meant a lot to all of us." "It was my pleasure," he replied softly. "Truly." As he turned to leave, Kathleen called after him, "Will we see you tomorrow?" He glanced back, his smile widening. "Count on it, Kathleen. Count on it." The weeks that followed the picnic brought gradual but noticeable changes to their unusual arrangement. Caroline began joining Zachary and Kathleen for Sunday dinners at Martha's boarding house. She started referring to her brother by name rather than title in conversation. Once, Kathleen even caught them laughing together over something James had done, a sound so unexpected that she paused in the doorway, not wanting to interrupt the rare moment of harmony. James thrived under their combined care. He began sitting up on his own, babbling constantly, and showing a determined interest in everything around him. His first tooth appeared, causing several sleepless nights that the three adults weathered together, taking turns walking the floor with the fussy infant. One evening in late October, as the first chill of autumn settled over Silver Creek, Zachary arrived at the schoolhouse with an unusual request. "The sheriff needs me to ride to Junction City tomorrow," he explained as they sat around the small table after dinner. "There's been trouble with cattle rustlers and the marshal there asked for assistance." "That sounds dangerous," Kathleen commented, concern evident in her voice. "It's mostly for show," Zachary assured her. "A uniform presence to discourage further incidents." Caroline, who had been mending one of James's gowns, looked up sharply. "How long will you be gone?" "3 days, perhaps 4. He hesitated, then continued, "Actually, I came to ask a favor. My cabin needs some attention before the weather turns cold. I wondered if you might check on it while I'm away, make sure the roof isn't leaking, that sort of thing." The request surprised both women. Zachary's cabin, situated on a small piece of land just outside town, was his private domain. Neither of them had ever been invited there. "Of course," Kathleen agreed. "We'd be happy to help." Caroline nodded her agreement, though more slowly. "When do you leave?" "First light," Zachary replied, his expression troubled. "I don't like being away with winter coming on, but duty calls." Later, after Zachary had said his goodbyes, Kathleen found Caroline standing by the window staring out at the darkening street. "He'll be fine," Kathleen said gently. "Zachary can take care of himself," Caroline sighed. "I know. It's just the last time he rode out on official business, my husband and son died." Kathleen moved to stand beside her. "That won't happen again." "You can't know that," Caroline replied, but the sharpness that usually accompanied any reference to the tragedy was absent. "No one can." "No," Kathleen agreed, "but we can trust that he'll be careful, that he'll come back." Caroline glanced at her, a knowing look in her gray eyes. "You care for him." It wasn't a question, but Kathleen answered anyway. "I do, more than I expected to." "He cares for you too," Caroline said, turning back to the window. "And for James, I've seen it growing these past weeks." "Does that trouble you?" Kathleen asked carefully. Caroline considered the question. "It should, once it would have, but now," she shook her head slightly. "Now I find I want him to be happy, even if I can't fully forgive the past." "That's progress," Kathleen observed. "Perhaps." Caroline's gaze was distant. "Or perhaps it's simply acceptance that life continues whether we will it or not." The next morning, Zachary stopped briefly at the schoolhouse before departing. He kissed James's forehead, squeezed his sister's hand, and then, in a gesture that surprised them all, brushed his lips against Kathleen's cheek. "Take care of each other," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "I'll return as soon as I can." After he left, Kathleen and Caroline exchanged a look of shared understanding. Something had shifted again, the boundaries of their unusual family reconfiguring into something new and undefined. That afternoon, after school dismissed, they took James in his carriage and walked to Zachary's cabin. It was a sturdy structure, simply built but well-maintained, set on a rise that offered a view of the mountains to the west. Caroline produced a key from her pocket. "He gave this to me years ago," she explained, "though I've never used it." Inside, the cabin was neat and spare, reflecting its owner's practical nature. A stone fireplace dominated one wall with a rocking chair positioned nearby. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt stood in one corner, a chest of drawers beside it. The kitchen area consisted of a cast iron stove, a small table with 2 chairs, and shelves holding basic provisions. What caught Kathleen's attention were the books, dozens of them, carefully arranged on shelves built into the wall beside the fireplace. "I didn't know Zachary was such a reader," she commented, running her fingers along the spines. "Shakespeare, Dickens, Irving, Twain. The collection was impressive for a frontier lawman. Our father was a schoolteacher, Caroline explained, setting James on a braided rug in the center of the room. He believed education was the greatest gift he could give us. Kathleen turned, surprised by this personal revelation. I didn't know that. There's a lot you don't know about us, Caroline said, but without rancor. Zachary doesn't speak easily of the past. Neither do you, Kathleen pointed out gently. Caroline acknowledged this with a slight nod. It's easier to keep moving forward when you don't look back. They set about their task, checking the roof for leaks, ensuring the chimney was clear, bringing in additional firewood from the stack outside. James crawled happily on the rug, exploring his new surroundings with enthusiastic gurgles. As they worked, Caroline gradually shared more about their childhood growing up in Ohio, their father's dedication to learning, their mother's garden that supplied herbs to half the county. What brought you west? Kathleen asked as they prepared to leave, the cabin now ready for its owner's return. Caroline paused, her hand on the door. Zachary came first after the war. He wrote such beautiful letters about the mountains, the clean air, the sense of possibility. Thomas and I followed after we married. A shadow crossed her face. We settled in Pinewood, about 50 miles from here. Zachary was already sheriff there. It was the most Caroline had ever said about the time before the tragedy. Kathleen waited, sensing there was more. Thomas built us a house at the edge of town, Caroline continued, her voice growing distant. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. When Michael was born, Zachary made him a cradle, carved it himself from pine wood, said every boy should sleep in a bed made with love. Kathleen glanced at James, now dozing in his carriage. He's a good man, your brother. Yes, Caroline agreed softly. Despite everything, he is. They locked the cabin and began the walk back to town, each lost in her own thoughts. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. If he doesn't return by Saturday, Caroline said suddenly, we should come back and start a fire in the evening, keep the cabin warm for his return. Kathleen smiled, recognizing the gesture for what it was, an olive branch extended across years of pain. I think that's an excellent idea. 2 days passed with no word from Zachary. On the third day, as Kathleen was teaching her afternoon arithmetic lesson, a commotion outside drew the children's attention. Sheriff Bradley appeared at the schoolhouse door, his expression grim. Mrs. Morgan, he said, removing his hat. A word, if I may. Kathleen's heart stuttered. Class, continue with your sums. I'll be right back. Outside, she found the sheriff standing with Caroline, who had come down from the living quarters with James at the sound of the disturbance. What is it? Kathleen asked, fear tightening her throat. Is it Zachary? There's been trouble in Junction City, Bradley confirmed. Zachary confronted the rustlers and there was gunfire. Caroline gasped, her face draining of color. He's alive, the sheriff hastened to assure them, but he's been shot. They're bringing him back now, should arrive by sundown. How bad is it? Kathleen asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. Took a bullet in the shoulder, according to the telegram. Lost blood, but the doctor there says he'll recover with proper care. Caroline swayed slightly and Kathleen moved to support her, taking James with her free arm. I'll dismiss the children early, Kathleen decided. We need to prepare for his arrival, the sheriff nodded. I've already asked Doc Wilson to be ready. We'll take him to his cabin, he'll rest better there than in town. The next hours passed in a flurry of activity. Kathleen sent her students home with a note explaining the situation. Caroline, her initial shock giving way to determined efficiency, prepared the cabin with fresh linens and medical supplies. Martha organized a group of women to cook meals that could be easily transported to the cabin. By the time the wagon bearing Zachary appeared on the road to town, everything was ready. Kathleen, Caroline, and Sheriff Bradley waited at the edge of town, James bundled warmly against the evening chill. Zachary was conscious but pale, his left shoulder heavily bandaged. He managed a weak smile when he saw them waiting. Quite a welcome committee, he said, his voice raspy with pain. Sorry for the trouble. Be quiet, you fool, Caroline replied, but there were tears in her eyes as she reached for his good hand. The next days established a new routine. Doc Wilson insisted Zachary remain in bed for at least a week, to prevent the wound from reopening. Caroline moved temporarily back to Martha's boarding house, giving Zachary her room above the schoolhouse. Kathleen split her time between teaching, caring for James, and tending to Zachary. It was during these quiet moments of care that the barriers between them truly began to fall. Zachary, weakened by his injury and the laudanum prescribed for pain, spoke more openly than he might have otherwise. I thought of you, he admitted one evening as Kathleen changed his bandage. When I was lying there after being shot, I thought of you and James and Caroline. I was afraid I wouldn't make it back to you. Kathleen's hands stilled. We were afraid of the same thing. Were you? His gray eyes searched her face. Yes, she said simply, very afraid. He captured her hand in his. Kathleen, I need to tell you something I've been feeling for some time now. Her heart raced, but she remained outwardly calm. I'm listening. When I found you on that trail with James, something changed in me. Something I thought had died with Thomas and Michael and all the guilt afterward. He tightened his grip on her hand. I want to be part of your life, yours and James's, not just as a friend or protector, but as what? She prompted when he hesitated. As a father to him, Zachary said, his voice rough with emotion, and as more than a friend to you if you'll have me. Kathleen felt tears prick her eyes. Zachary, he pressed on as if afraid she might refuse. I know it's soon, I know you're still grieving your husband. But life is short and uncertain, as we've both learned. I don't want to waste any more time pretending I don't care for you deeply. I care for you too, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. More than I thought possible after James Sr. died. Hope brightened his features. Then you'll consider it, allowing me to court you properly when I'm recovered. Kathleen thought of her late husband, his kind face, his quiet strength. He would have wanted her to find happiness again, to provide a father for their son. Yes, she said, squeezing his hand. I'll consider it. But you need to rest now and heal. His smile was worth every moment of uncertainty she'd felt. I'll heal faster now, he promised. Much faster. As November turned to December, Zachary regained his strength. The town prepared for Christmas, decorating the church and planning festivities. Snow dusted the mountains, and frost painted delicate patterns on the schoolhouse windows each morning. True to his word, Zachary began courting Kathleen properly once Doc Wilson declared him fit for normal activities. He brought small gifts, a ribbon for her hair, a carved wooden horse for James, fresh baked goods from the town's bakery. He escorted her to church on Sundays, sat with her family at community gatherings, and spent his free evenings at the schoolhouse, reading to James or discussing books with Kathleen. Caroline watched their growing relationship with quiet approval. Her own healing continued. Manifested in small ways, she began baking again, something she hadn't done since before the tragedy. She attended social functions without prompting. She even volunteered to help with the Christmas pageant at the church. One evening, as Christmas approached, the three adults sat in the schoolhouse living quarters after James had been put to bed. The conversation turned to holiday plans. We should have Christmas at the cabin, Zachary suggested. There's more room, and I've been thinking of cutting a pine tree to decorate. That would be lovely, Kathleen agreed, her hands busy with mending. Caroline looked up from her knitting. I could make those cinnamon stars Mother used to bake. You remember those? Zachary asked, surprise evident in his voice. Of course I do, Caroline replied. Christmas was always special in our house. A comfortable silence fell, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Then Caroline set aside her knitting and faced her brother directly. I've been thinking, she said, her voice carefully measured, about what happens after my 3 months are up. Kathleen and Zachary exchanged a glance. The trial period Caroline had agreed to was nearly complete, and neither had wanted to broach the subject of her departure. You're welcome to stay as long as you wish, Kathleen assured her. James adores you and I've come to depend on your help and friendship. Caroline smiled slightly. Thank you, but that's not what I meant. She took a deep breath. I've been offered the position of teacher at the orphan asylum in Denver. They need someone with experience caring for young children. You're leaving? Zachary asked, his disappointment evident. I'm considering it, Caroline corrected. The position doesn't begin until spring. Kathleen felt a pang at the thought of losing Caroline, who had become like a sister to her. Is this what you want? I think it might be, Caroline replied thoughtfully. Working with children again, but in a way that honors Michael's memory rather than simply reminding me of his loss. She looked at her brother. And I'll only be a day's journey away by train, close enough for visits. Zachary reached across the table to take his sister's hand. If it's what you want, Carrie, I'll support you, but know that you always have a home here with us. The casual use of us, including Kathleen and James in his definition of family, didn't go unnoticed by either woman. Caroline squeezed his hand, then released it. I know, she said softly. And that knowledge makes it possible for me to consider leaving. I couldn't have done so 3 months ago. Later, after Caroline had retired for the night, Zachary lingered with Kathleen by the fire. She's really healing, Kathleen observed, making plans for a future. Thanks to you, Zachary said, taking her hand, and James. Kathleen shook her head. We just provided the opportunity. Caroline did the hard work herself. Still, you created a safe place for her to try again. He lifted her hand to his lips. You have a gift for healing broken people, Kathleen Morgan. She smiled at him, warmed by more than the fire. Perhaps that's why we found each other. We all needed healing in different ways. I have something for you, Zachary said, reaching into his pocket. I was going to wait until Christmas, but now seems right. He pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Kathleen unwrapped it carefully to reveal a silver locket on a delicate chain. It was my mother's, Zachary explained as she opened the locket to find it empty. I thought perhaps you might put a small picture of James inside, and someday maybe another child beside him. The implication of his words wasn't lost on Kathleen. It's beautiful, Zachary. Thank you. He took the locket from her hands and moved behind her to fasten it around her neck. The weight of it against her skin felt right, as if it belonged there. Kathleen, he said, his voice low and serious as he moved to face her again. I need to ask you something important. Her heart quickened as he knelt before her chair, taking both her hands in his. These past months have shown me what I want for my future: a family, a home filled with love, a purpose beyond wearing a badge. His gray eyes held her steadily. I want those things with you and James. I want to be his father more than anything, and your husband if you'll have me. Tears blurred Kathleen's vision. Zachary, I know it hasn't been a year since your husband died, he continued earnestly. If you need more time, I'll wait, but I want you to know my intentions, to understand that what I feel for you is real and lasting. Kathleen thought of the journey that had brought her to this moment: the grief, the fear, the uncertainty of setting out alone with an infant. And then the unexpected joy of finding not just safety, but love in this small western town. I don't need more time, she said, her voice clear despite her tears. James Sr. would want us to be happy, to be a family. Yes, Zachary, yes, I'll marry you. His face transformed with joy as he rose to gather her in his arms. Their first real kiss was gentle, tentative, then deepening with shared emotion and promise. When they finally broke apart, Zachary rested his forehead against hers. I'll speak to the minister tomorrow. We could be married by Christmas if that's not too soon. Christmas would be perfect, Kathleen agreed, her heart full to bursting. A soft sound from the doorway made them turn. Caroline stood there, James in her arms, the baby having awakened for his late feeding. I couldn't help overhearing, she said, her expression serene. Congratulations to you both. Zachary moved to take James from his sister. Thank you, Caroline. Your blessing means everything to us. You have it completely, she assured him, her gaze moving between the newly engaged couple. You deserve happiness, both of you. As Zachary held James, the baby reached up to pat his face with a chubby hand, gurgling happily. The love in Zachary's eyes as he looked at the child was unmistakable. "Hello, son," he whispered, the words carrying a weight of emotion that filled the room. "I'm going to be your pa now, just as I promised." Kathleen moved to stand beside them, creating a circle of family that felt both new and ancient, fragile and unbreakable. Caroline watched them for a moment, then slipped quietly away, leaving the new family to their private joy. Christmas in Silver Creek was a celebration of renewal as much as tradition. The small church was decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, candles glowing in every window. Children performed the nativity story, their faces solemn with the importance of their roles. And on Christmas Eve, before the entire town, Kathleen Morgan and Zachary Blackwood were married. She wore a new dress of deep blue velvet, a gift from the women of Silver Creek. He wore his best suit, his badge polished to a high shine. James, dressed in a tiny suit made by Caroline, sat contentedly in his aunt's lap throughout the ceremony. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Zachary kissed Kathleen with a reverence that brought tears to more than one eye in the congregation. Then, in a gesture that spoke volumes, he lifted James from Caroline's arms and held him high. "My son," he declared, his voice ringing with pride and love. "My family." The celebration afterward was joyous music and dancing, food and laughter, the community coming together to welcome this new family into their midst. Sheriff Bradley made a toast that had everyone chuckling. Martha cried happy tears into her handkerchief, and the mayor declared it the finest Christmas in Silver Creek's history. Late that night, in the cabin that was now their home, Zachary built a fire while Kathleen put James to bed in the cradle Zachary had moved from the schoolhouse. Caroline had elected to stay in town, giving the newlyweds privacy for their first night as husband and wife. "Are you happy, Mrs. Blackwood?" Zachary asked, drawing Kathleen into his arms as they stood before the fireplace. "Completely," she assured him, lifting her face for his kiss. "And you, more than I ever thought possible." His hands framed her face gently. "When I found you on that trail, I never imagined we would end up here." "Fate has strange ways," Kathleen murmured, leaning into his embrace. "Not fate," Zachary corrected softly. Love finds a way when nothing else can." As the fire crackled and snow began to fall gently outside the window, Kathleen knew he was right. Love had brought them together, love for a child, love for family, love that persisted despite loss and pain, love that built bridges across the deepest chasms and healed the most wounded hearts. In the cradle nearby, James slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge, even at his young age, that he was cherished. And in the arms of her new husband, Kathleen found the home she had been seeking since the day she set out on that dusty trail with her infant son. Life in Silver Creek settled into a rhythm for the Blackwood family. Kathleen continued teaching, with Caroline assisting until her departure for Denver in the spring. Zachary maintained his duties as deputy while building an addition to the cabin, a proper bedroom for James, with windows facing the mountains. By summer, the town had fully embraced them as a family. No one remembered a time when Mrs. Blackwood wasn't the schoolteacher, or when Deputy Blackwood didn't have a son riding on his shoulders during Sunday afternoon walks. Caroline wrote weekly from Denver, her letters filled with stories of the orphan children in her care. She visited for James's first birthday, bringing gifts and news of her own blossoming friendship with a doctor who volunteered at the asylum. On a warm evening in late August, as Kathleen and Zachary sat on the porch of their cabin watching the sunset, James toddling between them on increasingly steady legs, Zachary took his wife's hand. "You ever think about that day on the trail?" he asked. "How different our lives might have been if I hadn't ridden by when I did." Kathleen squeezed his hand. "Sometimes. But then I remember something my father used to say, that the important journeys in life aren't about the destination, but about who we meet along the way." Zachary smiled, watching as James discovered a fascinating stick in the dirt. "Wise man, your father. He would have liked you," Kathleen assured him, "almost as much as James does." As if hearing his name, James looked up at them, his face breaking into a wide grin that showcased his new teeth. He abandoned his stick and toddled to Zachary, arms raised imperiously. "Up, Pa," he demanded, the words still new enough to bring joy to Zachary's face each time he heard them. Zachary scooped the boy into his lap, tickling him until he giggled uncontrollably. "What do you think, son? Should we tell Mama our secret?" James nodded enthusiastically, though it was unlikely he understood the question. Kathleen raised an eyebrow. "What secret?" Zachary reached into his pocket and produced a small wooden horse, intricately carved. "James and I have been planning something special." "Show Mama, son." James took the horse and proudly held it out to Kathleen. She accepted it with appropriate admiration, noting the care that had gone into its creation. "It's beautiful," she said, "but I don't understand the secret." Zachary's smile widened. "Turn it over." Kathleen did as instructed and found words carved into the base of the horse. "For baby sister." Her breath caught as she looked up at her husband, questions in her eyes. "I've noticed you've been tired lately," Zachary said gently. "And Martha mentioned you were feeling unwell in the mornings when you stopped by the boarding house last week." Kathleen's hand moved unconsciously to her stomach. She had suspected, but hadn't been certain enough to share her thoughts. "You're not upset?" she asked, searching his face. Zachary laughed, the sound full of joy. "Upset? Kathleen, I'm ecstatic. Another child to love, another piece of our family puzzle." James, not understanding but catching his father's excitement, clapped his hands. "Baby," he exclaimed, though the word sounded more like baby in his toddler speech. "Yes, sweetheart," Kathleen confirmed, her eyes filling with happy tears. "A baby. You're going to be a big brother." Later, after James had been tucked into bed with his new wooden horse standing guard on the shelf above, Kathleen and Zachary lay in their own bed, his hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. "I never thought I could be this happy again," Kathleen confessed in the darkness. "After James Sr. died, I believed that part of my life was over." "I felt the same after the fire," Zachary admitted. "I thought my punishment was to live alone with my guilt, watching happiness from a distance." And now, he drew her closer, his breath warm against her hair. "Now I understand that life isn't about what we lose, but what we find afterward. The courage to begin again, to love again, to build something new from the ashes of what came before." Kathleen turned in his arms to face him, her hand tracing the scar on his shoulder from the bullet wound. "When I saw you in that wagon, pale from loss of blood, I realized how much I needed you, not just as James's protector or my friend, but as the man who had somehow captured my heart when I wasn't looking. I knew I loved you the moment I saw you on that trail," Zachary confessed. "Standing there with your baby, ready to face whatever came, refusing to show fear even though I could see it in your eyes. I wanted to be the man who made that fear disappear forever." "You are," she assured him, pressing her lips to the scar. "You've given us safety, love, a home." "You've given me more," he countered. "A son, a child on the way, a reason to come home each night, a purpose beyond the badge." Outside, an owl called into the night, its voice carrying across the peaceful landscape. Inside the cabin, the small family slept, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. And in Denver, Caroline Blackwood penned another letter to her brother and sister-in-law, sharing news of her own engagement to Dr. Alan Peterson. The letter ended with words that echoed across the miles, binding them together despite the distance. "I understand now what you both tried to show me, that the heart's capacity for love is endless, that joy can follow sorrow, that family is not just who we're born to, but who we choose to journey with. Thank you for helping me find my way back to myself and to a future I never imagined possible. All my love, Caroline." Spring arrived with gentle rains and wildflowers carpeting the meadows around Silver Creek. Kathleen, now visibly expecting their second child, continued teaching with the help of the older students, who took turns entertaining James during lesson time. Caroline and Dr. Peterson married in a simple ceremony in Denver, with Zachary, Kathleen, and James traveling by train to attend. The reunion of the siblings, now both married and building new lives, brought healing full circle. "I never thought we'd be here," Caroline confessed to Kathleen as they watched Zachary and Alan discussing medical practices on the frontier. Both married again, both happy. "Life surprises us," Kathleen replied, her hand resting on her rounded belly. "Especially when we least expect it." Caroline's gaze softened as she watched James playing with a wooden puzzle Alan had given him. "He's going to be a wonderful big brother." "Just as you've been a wonderful aunt," Kathleen said warmly. "We miss you in Silver Creek." "I'll visit when the baby arrives," Caroline promised. "Alan is curious about frontier medicine. He might consider a practice in a smaller town someday." "Silver Creek could use a doctor of its own," Kathleen suggested, hope in her voice. Caroline smiled. "One step at a time, but I wouldn't rule it out." In June, as summer heat settled over the Western Territories, Sarah Elizabeth Blackwood entered the world during a gentle evening rainfall. She had her father's gray eyes and her mother's determined spirit, announcing her arrival with lusty cries that brought smiles to everyone in the small cabin. Zachary, who had paced anxiously during Kathleen's labor, held his daughter with tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "Perfect," he whispered, counting tiny fingers and toes. "Absolutely perfect." James, not quite 2 years old, studied his new sister with serious concentration before pronouncing, "Mine baby," and placing a slobbery kiss on her forehead. The town celebrated the new arrival with the same enthusiasm they'd shown for the Blackwoods' wedding. Sheriff Bradley declared himself honorary grandfather to both children. Martha knitted enough baby clothes for triplets, and Mayor Thompson granted Kathleen an extended leave from teaching duties, with full pay. On a crisp autumn day, as golden leaves drifted from the trees surrounding their cabin, the Blackwood family gathered on the porch for a photograph, a new technology that had reached even their remote corner of the frontier. Zachary held Sarah, now 4 months old and smiling readily. Kathleen sat beside him, James on her lap. And standing behind them, having arrived the previous day for a visit, were Caroline and Alan, their own happiness evident in their relaxed postures and easy smiles. "Hold still now," the photographer instructed from beneath his black cloth. "This moment only comes once." As the flash powder ignited and the shutter clicked, capturing this tableau of family forged through love and choice rather than merely blood, Zachary reached for Kathleen's hand. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice too low for the photographer to hear. "For what?" she asked, though she knew the answer in her heart. His gaze encompassed their children, his sister and her husband, their home, the life they had built together. "For everything. For that day on the trail, for James, for believing in second chances." Kathleen squeezed his hand, her heart full to overflowing with gratitude for the journey that had brought them here from a dusty trail where a widow and her infant had found an unexpected protector, to this moment of completion and belonging. "I want to be his father more than anything," Zachary had told her that first day, looking at James with longing and hope. Now he was father to not one but 2 children, husband to a woman who adored him, brother to a sister who had found her way back to him, a man whose badge was only one part of a life rich with purpose and love. "Always," Kathleen promised, the word carrying the weight of their shared past and the promise of their future. Always and forever. And in the photograph that would hang on their cabin wall for decades to come, through all the changes and challenges life would bring, that promise was visible in the way they leaned toward each other. A family bound by choice and love, finding in each other the home they had each been seeking all along.